Variables in Ansible are used to account for differences between servers. By using variables, I have the ability to keep a nice layer of abstraction in my playbook and define my variables as I need to in various host or group vars files. There are innumerable use cases for variables in Ansible, so I'm only going to cover a few of them today, and then it's up to you to continue to learn after. The first thing that we need to cover is variable precedence, which is basically how your variables overwrite each other if you have them defined in multiple places. As of 2.0, there are now 16 levels of variable precedence. I've listed them here in this slide in order of overwriting ability from 16, which is role defaults, to 1, which is extra vars. Up to this point, we've briefly talked about host facts, which is information gathered about the remote host using the setup module. We've talked about setting inventory host variables like Ansible underscore user, and we also set a play variable when we set the MySQL port to 3306. You can see that there are still several vars options that take precedent over those three, ending with extra vars, which will always take precedent over any other variable set. This can seem confusing when you're first starting out, but generally speaking, you should try to set your variables in as few places as possible to ensure that your variables don't step on each other accidentally. In future lessons, we'll see variables placed in a couple more locations, so stay tuned. Now that you have a general idea of where to place your variables, what are some use cases for them? Probably the most common use case is to use variable substitution inside your playbooks. Variable substitution is pretty much what we've already done in our mariadb.yml file. In my var section, I defined a variable that is located in my template file. However, I can also do this in tasks, like with my log file task. I can set that path to a variable and define that in my var section. So this would look like log path, and then I would go up here and define that variable as varlog. Now, if I don't want to keep these variables defined in the playbook, I can actually have a variable file alongside my playbook and define them there. So just exiting out of this file, I have a file called mariavars.yml, and I define those two variables in that file, and those are the only things in there because this is just a vars file. So now if I actually want to use this file, I would go back to my main playbook, and then I would change the vars section to be vars underscore files. And then I would get rid of these two variables because I no longer need to define them here. And I would just put the name of the file that I want to use, which is maria underscore vars.yml. Now, the concept of VARS files, especially with sensitive data, will be explored in more depth in a future lesson. So, continuing on with variable substitution, I can also set my host line to a variable with something like hosts, my hosts, and then I can define the host I want to use at runtime. So, if I exit out of this, I could run ansible playbook I hosts mariadb.yml and then pass extra vars hosts equal test server. And then if I ran this, it would basically be like I was declaring that host inside the playbook, except I'm passing it as an extra var. So it's going to take precedent over anything else. This is super useful if you have a large number of hosts and you want that flexibility to not have to modify the playbook each time you run it to target different inventory. Okay, so another variable use case is registered variables. This is commonly used with the shell and command modules, so we can utilize the output of that command as a variable later. So I created another file called varcases.yml. And if I wanted to do something in a task like check the date on the server and then register that output and then print it out with a debug statement, I could do something like get date on the server, and then I'm going to use the shell module and put the command in. So that's date. Then I'm going to register the output of that. So use the register keyword. So register output. And now I'm going to print that out. So debug message equals the date is variable output dot standard out. Now I'm not going to run this just yet, but when I do, the output of that task should say the date is and then whatever today's date is. And registered variables are seen a lot with conditional statements, and we're going to explore that as well in a future lesson. So, the last use case we'll talk about today is variables gathered from fact data. Now, remember that we can get all sorts of facts by using the setup module, and this is going to happen automatically in a playbook unless I set gather facts to false. Now, I can print out the vars that are gathered by using a debug statement. And so this would look something like debug var equals Ansible underscore distribution underscore version. And then that would output the distribution version of my host that I'm targeting. Now, facts, just like registered variables, are also commonly used with conditional statements. But for another use case, we could use facts to group certain machines together temporarily for the duration of the playbook run. And we would do that with the group by module. So, another task I could do group some machines together temporarily, and I'd use the group by module there. Key equals rel underscore, and then I'm going to use that same fact as a variable here, distribution version, close my curly braces. I'm going to register the result of that, call that group result. And then I'm going to include a debug statement to debug the output of that var. And so now, after this runs, I would have a group that I can target easily. And this is probably only useful if you're trying to group together a subset of hosts and less useful with one host, but I did want to show it to you anyway. And before we run this was an example of using Ansible facts, but you can also use custom facts or local facts in FAXD as well. So I'm just going to exit out of this and then run that var cases playbook to show you how everything looks. So it's going to gather facts to start, and then I'm going to get the date on the server. And now the next task was the debug message, which shows me the date, which is Saturday, March 5th. I get my Ansible distribution version, which is 7.2. And then I've got my ad group, which is rel 7.2.